the Adventist Health Study is not just one study, it's multiple, hundreds of studies. The first Adventist, it was called the Adventist Mortality Study, which actually compared Seventh-day Adventists with the general population in California. And what they found is the Adventists lived longer and had less disease. So then they did the Adventist Health Study 1, which looked at the possible reasons why the Adventists actually had less disease. Smoking less, exercising more, eating healthier, more plant-based diets, and all of that. And then the Adventist Health Study 2 came along, and it began in 2002. And it followed about it is still following, it's following about 96,000 individuals from North America, the United States, and Canada. And they look at meat eaters, semi-vegetarians, pesco-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans. And of course, it's it's a study where they're looking at health outcomes over time. And what they've found is they've found a lot. So there have been a lot of reports. So where heart disease is concerned, it was very, very interesting because cardiovascular disease was about 42% lower among health-conscious vegans versus health-conscious omnivores, controlled for smoking and drinking and exercise and all of that. For lacto-ovo-vegetarians, it was about 23% lower. However, female vegans didn't enjoy any advantage over the female omnivores, and that, to me, was a bit of a mystery. Dr. Michael Orlick was the lead author on this study, and I asked him if there was an explanation for that, and I had a theory. My theory is that, I don't know if it's correct or not, but I think that there's much less of a difference between, and maybe you could chime in on this, Milton, between the female vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores than there may be between the males. Because from my experience in the Adventist world, I see even the omnivorous women not eating very much meat, where the men may eat quite a lot more, and so they would enjoy an even greater advantage going vegan than would the women. And Michael Orlick, there are a number of possible explanations, and he said basically we really don't know. But that, did you want to chime in on that?
Well, I would say that I think that your impressions are probably certainly correct to an extent and moving in the right direction. I also just want to throw out one other little tidbit that when they looked at least in the Adventist Health Study 1, cancer risk, the Adventists had lower risk for all cancers except prostate cancer. And one of the reasons is because most of them are lacto-ovo, and the primary risk factor for prostate cancer is dairy consumption. At least that's my theory.
Yeah, and in the Adventist Health Study 2, they compared vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans were at an advantage as far as I can recall. Where cancer is concerned, the vegans had about 16% lower rates, and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, I think it was 8%, compared to similar health-conscious omnivores. They looked at diabetes. Vegans had 62% less diabetes, and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, I think it was 34% or so less. They looked at kidney disease, and it was about half, 52% less kidney disease among lacto-ovo-vegetarian and vegans combined. They looked at longevity, and the vegans had a 15% advantage over they had 15% lower mortality. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians had about 9%. So these studies are very, to me, I like the study because we're seeing long-term outcomes in health that are favorable for people eating plant-based, so I like that. But I mean, if you look at Epic Oxford, and I didn't mention yesterday, and I should have mentioned, The latest 2019 study that has looked at cardiovascular disease, they found about 22% reduction in cardiovascular disease for vegetarians, but the vegetarians had about a 20% increased risk of of strokes, which were mostly hemorrhagic strokes. And so I think we need to do more investigation, and you may have an explanation for that, but at this point, I think we need a little bit more research to look at that.
Well, so couple quick comments. First, when you hear about, and Brenda, by the way, is remarkable, and you could play the let's see if Brenda's right game with all these statistics that she throws at you. Trust me, she's always right. So she actually knows all these numbers. It's crazy. But a lot of these numbers are relative risk. So if you have a 23% increase in the risk of X and a 22% reduction in the risk of Y, you're still obligated to ask, well, what was the baseline risk of X? What was the baseline risk of Y, right? So you could increase the risk of something, you could double the risk. That could mean that, it goes from 1 in 2 to 2 in 3, it could be a very high risk. But if your risk at baseline is 1 in a million, and you double it, it's 2 in a million. It's still very unlikely to happen. The hemorrhagic strokes that Brenda just referenced are very uncommon relative to ischemic strokes. So there was a slight increase in risk in the vegans, but at a very low baseline, the absolute risk there was really very tiny. The other thing, I just want to leave you with what I hope is a bit of pithy wisdom from the world of statistics and logic. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So what Brenda cited for the Adventist study was that the vegan women did not seem to have an advantage relative to omnivorous or vegetarian, lacto-vegetarian women in the same population. That may simply be a lack of statistical power. Because if you match for smoking, and you match for sleep, and you match for stress, and you match for spirituality, and you match for lifestyle, and everybody's diet is of pretty high quality, and everybody's taking very good care of themselves, then the difference attributable to just the differences in their diet in terms of health outcomes is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as each other important element in the health equation becomes standardized across the group. Doesn't mean there isn't a difference, but as the difference you're looking for gets smaller, you need an ever larger cohort and more time to find it. And the fact that you didn't find it may simply mean group wasn't big enough. You didn't have enough time for that because they were matched on so many parameters that the outcome differences were what was left, sort of the residual of all that, and it may be fairly small. It may still be quite meaningful. Keep in mind that if something only affects 1 in 100,000 people, there'd be many thousands of cases in the U.S. each year in a population of 300 million. So even small risks may translate into a lot of very unhappy families at the end of a given year. But those risks may be very hard to spot, even if you have 1,000 people in your study, even if you have 5,000. You might need 100,000 people in your study for a long time to find those small differences.
I just want to throw out a couple of thoughts. I agree with you, David, that the way Brenda has these statistics memorized is, it's actually encouraging because it suggests that, yeah, your brain is going to be cool on a plant-based diet. But another reason I think that they may not have seen differences in the women in particular is because, as you know, when it comes to plant-based Adventists, the number of vegans is much smaller than the number of lacto-ovo vegetarians. And given that women are already at lower risk for heart disease, that would mean that you would need a lot more women to actually power the study well enough to see the differences that were there. So that's probably an artifact of just kind of study design and population. But the question I want to ask both of you briefly is, when that Oxford data came out suggesting there may be a small increase in hemorrhagic stroke, there was a lot of discussion about the statistical analysis and the suggestion that the analysis was flawed and that that's why they got those incongruous results suggesting that vegans were more likely to have a hemorrhagic stroke. What do you guys think of that? Do you think that the way the data was analyzed was suspect?
I should be able to answer based on my training, but I don't remember the statistical method. My recollection, though, is that it was a relative risk of an extremely small baseline, and the error bars were wide. So I remember looking at it and shrugging my shoulders, thinking 22% variance in a very low baseline risk. This is going to get distorted in the media because there's a massive reduction in something that's common and a slightly lesser increase in something that's rare. And the error bars are wide, meaning we're not even really sure that it's happening, and it's just barely significant. So, it was sort of borderline fluke. I didn't notice any problem with the methods per se, other than the methods were translated by the media into a false equivalence. This gets better, this gets worse. But we were talking about massively different levels of baseline risk. Something common got a lot better, and something very rare may have gotten a little worse. That's not an equivalence.
And I have no idea. All I can say is I trust Paul Appleby, the statistician for Epic Oxford. He has tremendous amount of experience, and I highly doubt that he would make that kind of error.